Evan Belgord, welcome to the program. Welcome to the Islam Unravelled podcast, the Anti-Racist podcast, where we work together with various leaders of every kind to really address the big issue of the day, which is, again, racism based on color and religion. And so, Evan, you are the executive, you are the CEO of the Canadian Antihate Network. Please talk about how you got into that position and your kind of vision and mission leading up to the role that you currently have.
Sure. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I was making a transition from working in politics to working in journalism. And at that time, not a lot of people were covering this new rise of hate movements in North America, but especially not in Canada. So we saw around the general election around 2015, a big uptick in, let's say, the number of hate groups and kind of online hate activity. And that is kind of a natural response in countries whenever somebody is elected that is perceived to be progressive or multicultural. There's often kind of this far right backlash of organizing against the government and against what they perceive to be, progressiveness, multiculturalness, and of course, very racist elements kind of in that organizing. So that's a fairly natural occurrence. Obviously, not a good thing, but it's a pattern. At this time, though, hate groups in Canada were mostly being inspired by hate groups in Europe. Groups like Pegida and the Soldiers of Odin were explicitly anti-Muslim, anti-Islam. So they didn't manage to get much of a foothold in Canada immediately, though. There were a few attempts by groups like the Soldiers of Odin to do some in-person activities, rallies, and things like that, and they were kind of stymied by anti-fascist activists, especially in Quebec, around that time period. So they hadn't amounted to much yet beyond, kind of spreading their hate online. Then came the election of Trump. And so when the Trump campaign was in full steam, we saw just a big explosion of these groups, both in number, members, and rhetoric, and how much they wanted to organize. We saw a lot of that happening online, but still nothing had happened kind of on the ground in Canada yet. So as a new journalist, I was just paying attention to what was happening online, watching what was happening in the States, wondering, okay, are they going to start organizing kind of in person here? And they did. And that was around when Rebel Media was in opposition to Motion 103, which was this motion to condemn Islamophobia before the House of Commons. And there's a lot of fear mongering around it, saying it was going to criminalize criticisms of Islam or kind of dissent more broadly. And of course it wasn't, but it acted as a lightning rod, and these hate groups took to the streets. So I was in Toronto, of course, and we saw a number of these groups start demonstrating in front of Toronto City Hall. And again, I was a new journalist at the time, so I was covering this stuff. I was attending these demonstrations, and I was trying to tell the story and try to raise a bit of an alarm around what was happening, because you attend these demonstrations and the hate groups and kind of their supporters and sympathizers that are organizing these things are very prone to violence, right? They celebrate and encourage the use of violence against their opponents, whether those be folks who are Muslim or anti-racist and anti-fascist who would demonstrate against their organizing. And their rhetoric, at first I started calling this an anti-Islam thing because that's what they were calling it. And I was kind of naive at the time. So they were saying, this is just, we're just being critical of the religion. We're just being critical of the negative parts of the religion, et cetera, et cetera. And that just wasn't true. Because, you'd see them have other forms of racism as well. And I saw them firsthand misidentify people with brown skin as being Muslim who were not Muslim, right? So, it became clear to me within the first few months of covering this that this wasn't a question of, let's say, responsible, nuanced critiques of one religion or another. It really was just kind of naked racism. And so at that part, I started calling it the anti-Muslim movement. And many kind of months later, that started to catch on and other people started using that in their language and in their reporting. But I was pushing for it at the time because they were really trying to whitewash this is just being kind of like against the religion, when it wasn't just that, right? It was really, there was a lot of racism baked into it. So I was still, like I said, I was a new journalist at the time. I was starting to get a bit of attention around my work, and speaking with a number of advocates, researchers, other journalists about the issue. And it kept escalating, right? We kept seeing more and more kind of hate activity and hate groups. So I was using a resource at the time called Anti-Racist Canada. And it was this blog who was run by a school teacher from Alberta named Kurt Phillips. And he'd been running this blog on his own time for about a decade. And it just basically tracked what are hate groups up to. So everything from, the assaults and the murders carried out by neo-Nazis and neo-Nazi terrorist groups, to starting to cover this anti-Muslim movement. And of course, just as a little sidetrack here, 2015, it's not like all this racism and this hate just started. I mean, that groundwork had been laid by xenophobic comments made by prominent figures in Canada, by what had happened with the growth of anti-Muslim hate groups in Europe and things of that nature. So it didn't come out of nowhere, right? But what was new about 2015 and 2016 moving forward was just how bold they got, how comfortable they felt speaking in the mainstream about their hateful views, and how comfortable they felt to organize in real life and hold demonstrations, and in some cases, even like stake out mosques, quote unquote, to like look for terrorist activity, which is just ridiculous. So we're looking across Canada. I'm like, who else is doing this work across Canada? And there were great anti-racist and anti-fascist and community groups who were doing stuff in their local area, right? But not all of them were doing the kind of deep, let's say like deep dive monitoring. Not all of them were like kind of infiltrating hate groups online or keeping good track of what their activities were. And not all of these groups or these activists had as easy access to the media or to journalism. So, then we look around the world and we see, in the United States, there's an organization like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which acts as a watchdog on hate groups. In the UK, there's Hope Not Hate. So, we're looking across Canada, we're like, what's the equivalent of that here? And it became, I'm talking to the researchers, I'm talking to people who advocated a lot against hate groups in the 90s and early thousands. And the answer was there just wasn't anything that was kind of professionalized and organized and across Canada. So we saw that and we said, if we want it to exist, we're going to have to be the ones to create it. And that's what we did. So that was about 3 years ago, we founded the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Since then, we've had a number of successes. We've shut down some neo-Nazi podcasts. The Yellow Vest Canada movement, for example, which, ripped off this anti-austerity movement in France, was led by anti-Muslim hate groups. Every single hate group we tracked basically got involved in it. And, after several months of reporting on that, eventually, mainstream politicians were decrying them, and eventually media reports were getting it right, that it wasn't just about oil and gas. So, we've had a number of pretty good successes since we started. The government's now consulting with us on what to do about online hate on major platforms such as Facebook. So in the interim, most of our work is kind of capital J journalism and capital A advocacy. We advocate for the changes that we want to see, but we also ring alarm bells and use journalism to kind of support the advocacy, right? So we go out there, we find out what's going on, we infiltrate hate groups, we make people aware of what they're saying and what they're planning, and then we advocate for ways to counter it.
And, you brought an interesting point, this distinction, is it anti-Islam or anti-Muslim? And as you know, in the Middle East, there are people that look as white Caucasian as anybody. So if you would happen to see a Syrian person or a Palestinian person or a Lebanese person, they're very, very much similar complexion to Europeans. So, and the Turkish community as well. So again, skin color is one thing, but one key issue in terms of this work and how hate groups have gotten a huge life online with social media forums like 8chan, 4chan, their ability to espouse their views, to unite, to find a huge audience that agrees with their views, not only in the United States, not only in Canada, but Europe as well. So this transnational white supremacy that is uniting these groups all across borders, and it seems like a common thread is anti-Muslim bigotry as a way to say that's an existential enemy, and the Great Replacement theory is one of their core kind of philosophies that justifies advocating for violence against Muslims. Now, in Toronto, a caretaker of a mosque was killed. His throat was slit by a far-right group. I believe it was called the Nine Ankles. Maybe we can talk about these groups in Canada that are operating. And so some are distinct. How are they different? If it's Adam Waffen, if it's the Soldiers of Odin, the Three Percenters, and this strangely disturbing group, the Nine Angles, which is a satanic Nazi cult, which seems like right out of fiction. So let's maybe talk about however you want to talk about each of these groups and what their similarities and differences are.
Sure. I mean, I'd start with movements, because what we're increasingly seeing is a little bit different from the 90s and the thousands. The hate ecosystem today is really, it's movement based. So groups will emerge out of the movements, but the movements themselves exist without specific kind of groups. So kind of to discuss that, we have different hate movements in Canada, all of which I'll just kind of broadly refer to as the far right or the racist right. But we have a number of hate movements in Canada. We have the anti-Muslim movement. We have this anti-LGBTQ plus movement. We have, a movement of individuals who organize around their hatred of women, that being the involuntary celibate movement, and other hate movements. The emergence I touched on of the anti-Muslim movement, kind of driven by the rhetoric of rebel media, but also kind of hate coming out of Europe. That anti-Muslim movement has moved on to other things. When M103 meant that the sky wasn't falling, they changed their criticism to be of the liberal government and leftists and anti-fascists more generally, and the anti-Muslim stuff kind of simmered. When the issue is the police murder of George Floyd, you'll see more and more anti-Black racism. When the issue is wet sweat and solidarity blockades and Indigenous lives, the conversation will be around using their cars to run through demonstrators who are blocking intersections and things like that. And today it's COVID. So they jump onto whatever the hot topic is, but I still keep referring to them as the anti-Muslim movement because that's their DNA. That's what they were born out of. And no matter what they're kind of hating on and criticizing, you'll still find plenty of comments that are, explicitly racist towards Muslim folks. So that's kind of like their baked in DNA. And we've had several groups. We have a lot of groups in Canada, and they kind of spring up, merge, split, die on a very regular basis. So it's actually kind of hard to keep anything like a comprehensive list of them, but some have been more durable than others, right? So the Soldiers of Odin are still around. They were, it's primarily an anti-Muslim group. They were founded by a self-identifying neo-Nazi from Finland. And here in Canada, especially in the early days, a lot of their organizers and organizations were explicitly neo-Nazi. That changed a bit, where they didn't want to keep paying dues to the original chapter in Europe. And also they didn't want to be called Nazis all the time. So some of the groups kind of split off. And so the Soldiers of Odin has been a very fragmented kind of series of groups since then, where I'd even go as far as to say, it's more accurate to say there are a bunch of individual groups than one group today. But I mean, every one of them who continues to use the name, the Soldiers of Odin, is hearkening back to that anti-Muslim and neo-Nazi thing that they were born out of. And they choose to keep that name, right? Like that's a distinct choice. Because if the KKK came into your neighborhood and said, oh, we're not that KKK, you'd still be pretty upset about it. The same thing with the Soldiers of Odin today. So they're still around and they're doing things to kind of whitewash their image, like needle pickups or sometimes like donation drives around Christmas. They do things like that, but that's a very common kind of far right tactic. Golden Dawn in Greece did the same thing. All sorts of hate movements do the same thing, where they'll do some charitable work. There's another neo-Nazi group, neo-fascist neo-Nazi group in Quebec called Attalon, and they engage in the same thing. They'll give out food to homeless people, but only to white homeless people, right? It's part of what they do. So yeah, I mean, are there any groups in particular you'd like me to touch on? Because there's quite a number of them. So I'll need a little direction if you want me to. comment on any one
Yeah.
specific one.
Well, let's talk about Soldiers of Odin, because they actually protested a mosque here in British Columbia, in the city of Surrey, the Surrey Al Jamia Mosque. So they had their megaphone, and we worked with the the RCMP hate crimes team, and in a previous interview with their lead officer, his name is Corporal Anthony Statham. He says one thing unique about Muslim communities is protests, that people come to protest mosques. That is a very unique thing for any religious group, to have people come protest their place of worship. So that is our experience of Soldiers of Odin here. So let's maybe talk about them, like in terms of across Canada, like you're saying, some of them, they grow, they die, they splinter, they now, in terms of like Ontario being the most densely populated province in Canada, so population, and then how it is out east compared to out west, and then the other thing I would like to bring up is Alberta, which has seen a whole slate of attacks on Muslim women that wear hijab, and they've been attacked in public, verbally, physically, and then here in British Columbia, several Muslim women in hijab, typically on transit, is where they've been attacked. So let's talk about the influence of these far right groups here out west in British Columbia and Alberta.
Sure. So like you'd expect, where there's more population, you're going to find more hate groups. And I often talk about this as being kind of fundamental to the understanding of how hate operates in Canada versus the United States. So Canada, this has been said ad nauseum, but Canada is not special. We're not especially nice on like a per capita basis. We're not that much better than the United States. What's different is that in the United States, within like a 4-hour drive, you're going to be able, there's going to be living like twice as many people as all of Canada, right? You're within like 4 major population centers within a 4-hour drive. So when they want to get together and have a hate rally or something, it looks way larger, and like you can see it on TV, and it looks way bigger than it does in Canada. But proportionately, it's a very significant problem here too. And we see the greatest kind of, I'd say, hate group organizing occurs in Ontario, Quebec, BC, Alberta, and there's been a kind of a sharp uptick on the East Coast. Still not as significant in raw numbers, but a very, very significant uptick on the East Coast. And speaking about Alberta for a second, we just did some polling on how significant do people think online hate is in Canada, and what should be done about it, is broadly speaking what the poll was about. And we found that in Alberta and Saskatchewan, people were much more likely to report hate and racism not being as significant of an issue, and also to oppose, more likely to oppose measures to combat it. So there is an issue there. And of course, we've seen, as you mentioned, that several women who wear hijab have been assaulted in recent weeks. In BC, we're seeing a really sharp increase in anti-Asian hate crimes, it being, Vancouver in particular being one of the densest populations of Asian folks in Canada, particularly Chinese Canadians. So we're seeing kind of a sharp uptick there as they bear the brunt of hate inspired by, let's call it COVID misinformation. So we're seeing that right now. BC has also had a very long history of neo-Nazi activity going back to the 90s and thousands. It really was like Alberta, BC, and Ontario back then that was very, very active. And some of that still remains. We still track some neo-Nazis from back in the day, and really awful ones that, for example, lit somebody on fire. We're still tracking them, and they still exist in BC. And you're going to find chapters of larger groups or larger, let's call them brands. You're going to find chapters of these larger brands like the Soldiers of Odin across Canada, including in BC and particularly in Alberta.
And in Alberta, a group called the 3 Percenters, a paramilitary group that is doing arms training for some perceived Muslim invasion, or is the goal expulsion of Muslims, killing of Muslims? what is the objective? The reason I bring it up, in our research when we did our transnational forum on white supremacy terrorism, the perpetrator in New Zealand, with the white replacement, the great replacement theory, that part of it was to advocate for killing wholesale men, women, children, elderly. So that's a very disturbing kind of thought process where, like, sadly, I think I suffered from PTSD watching the video of the GoPro and him doing what he did. He had no hesitation, no mercy. He was planning this for 2 years. So with that kind of ideology permeating throughout all these groups, getting back to the 3%ers, it does seem like a violent kind of objective against Muslims, immigrants, and others that they hate. If we could talk about that kind of philosophy and the 3%ers and kind of what they're preparing for, possibly, is that in line with what we've just kind of discussed?
Yeah, so the 3%ers have been around for quite a long time, longer in the United States. There were members of a 3%ers group who were convicted because they were planning on bombing / burning down this refugee center of sorts. Here in Canada, at one point they were staking out at least one mosque, and they would be going into nature to practice like a paramilitary, right? They'd be doing drills, shooting drills. They'd be doing other kind of survival training, and that's doesn't make them super unique, but that is a big part of the 3%ers DNA, is this idea that the world is going to hell, and when that happens, they're going to kind of be this armed force that's going to protect their own. So they're preppers. It's kind of a big part of their ideology. One of the main leaders of the 3%ers, and they've gone through their own splits, and in different provinces they'll have different leadership, things like that. But one of their main leaders actually said, and we're in some of the private Facebook groups, and I'm quoting here: "The only good Muslim is a dead Muslim." So that is coming from like the head of the 3%ers, and it does kind of represent some of their ethos. Are they directly saying that they want to be the ones to carry to genocide? Yes and no. There's definitely those like genocidal promoting comments within them. They're more so like you mentioned, the great replacement, right? So it's a conspiracy theory that there are shadowy elites who are changing society through media, through laws, through governments, so on and so forth, to make it so that white people don't have as many kids, and simultaneously bring in immigrants from other countries to like replace the white race. So it's not like a nuanced conversation of where demographics in a country are going, right? Because it's a conspiracy, because they're attributing like a master plan behind it. And if you think that the people running that master plan are like the Muslim Brotherhood or some other Muslim organization, then you get something like the 3%ers, right? And other hate groups will actually think that it's the Jews controlling the Muslims coming in to do white genocide. But either way, I mean, white genocide, whether you're talking a neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic group, or you're talking a primarily anti-Muslim group, it's the same theory. It's just who's ultimately pulling the strings. So and it's really important, the role of conspiracy in these hate movements. You can't get somebody to go out and commit an absolutely horrific act of slaughter without first pumping them up. And the way you do that, and the way these hate movements do it, is they convince them that there's this existential threat. They convince them that it's basically like the apocalypse, and if you do nothing, then white people are all going to die out and be replaced by the people they don't like, in this case, Muslims. So you convince them that there's this apocalyptic problem, and there's somebody to blame, and there's a solution, right? And the solution in the case of Christchurch terrorist, of course, was terrorism. It was a mass murder attack. So that's how we get incidents like that. It comes down to this this conspiracy theory that you referenced, the white genocide or white replacement conspiracy theory, is what has inspired this terrorist attack and others.
And with Alexander Bissonnette in Quebec and Quebec City, and I think some of the photos of him wearing a MAGA hat, a Donald Trump cap, and I think there's a common kind of getting indoctrinated online by these forums, and with QAnon and conspiracy theories right online, and also state actors that want to foment dissent amongst racial groups, religious groups, and memes and articles trying to kind of sow division amongst people. Like getting back to Quebec City, was he affiliated with any of these far-right groups, or was he just a lone kind of person, not necessarily physically affiliated, but online indoctrinated with a lot of this content online to kind of, as you said, kind of amp him up with all this kind of fear mongering, and prompt him to do something about that. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, so I mean, there's not really any such thing as a lone actor, right? I mean, we all live in society and are creatures of society and are impacted by, what's going on in the national consciousness and the national conversation. In this case, Alexandre Bissonnette was consuming anti-Muslim sentiment, some of it quite mainstream, others a bit more fringe, but still easily accessible content. And speaking of the conspiracy theory, the content that he's consuming is saying, there's this apocalyptic situation happening, right? With Muslim immigration or, white people being replaced, right? So he's become convinced that he's a savior, he's doing a good thing by going out and committing like a mass atrocity and a mass attack. And this is one of the parts of my job I hate the absolute most is, we can look at his, who he reads on social media. We can see that, he's following these anti-Muslim figures, and then he goes out and acts on the fear that they've put in him, right? And those people who put that fear in him are never going to be held responsible for the murders that he did, when they do bear some responsibility for it, because they're spreading lies and misinformation and hate propaganda. And when people act on it, and people will act on it, they escape responsibility. So that's one of the hardest things, and why there's no really such thing as a lone actor. I mean, these people who carry out these atrocities, it's everything from the mainstream messaging from kind of far right but still mainstream sources, down to the most extreme propaganda that gets them, right? But it's an entire ecosystem. And once you start engaging with mainstream hateful figures, social media algorithms and stuff are going to throw you more and more kind of extreme content until you're going out and seeking out some of the most extreme content. And there's awful repercussions.
And now getting to organized groups that are well funded. So whether it's Act Now or Rebel Media, or groups that are very organized, they have a systematic approach, media programs, events, and funding. Let's talk about how these groups are really they're funded, they're mobilized, they're motivated, how they're kind of like the engine that propels this hate online and off.
Yeah, so the funding is a really difficult question. So groups that might be operating in the United States as charities or nonprofits have to disclose more than groups do in Canada. So we don't know the sources of funding for several of these larger organizations like Act for Canada or Rebel Media, which is not a charity, of course, but we don't know too much about their sources of funding. What we do know, though, is that Rebel Media, for example, they put out some posts just before Christmas saying that somebody just called in, I think it was like a $300,000 debt or something on them. And they were able to crowdsource that funding within a week or so, right? So there's an amazing ability for them to raise money, because fear is a powerfully motivating tactic. And kind of as anti-racist groups and anti-hate groups and on the left, we don't have the same ability, or we're perhaps more principled than to purposely like try to cause alarm in order to raise money, right? Like, we don't get me wrong, we publish things that are alarming and concerning, but we don't take it to the nth degree that we, are telling people that the sky is falling, which a lot of these places are there. That's their constant message: the sky is falling, give us money, or else, it'll fall on you. So they have an amazing ability to raise funds that we can't really match. Now, there's a bit of good news in that, we just found out yesterday that Rebel Media got demonetized on YouTube, and they claim that that's going to cost them something like $300,000 or $400,000. And I don't, of course, you got to take everything that Rebel Media says with a grain of salt, but at least that's a piece of good news there. So yeah, I mean, as groups that counter them, we need to be figuring out ways to leverage our much kinder, much more conscious audiences to give us money to kind of push back against hate.
And also, critical avenues of the fight against racism is the legal channels. And we had a good opportunity to meet your colleague Richard Warman, and how he, as a lawyer, has successfully sued a lot of these groups and engaged in litigation to stop certain aspects of their work. If we could talk about the legal aspect and the legal tools that can be used to combat this.
Sure. So I mean, legal stuff is tricky because sometimes it works, often it doesn't, and it's very expensive. So I can give a few examples. There was a neo-Nazi collective that was saying some of the worst and most defamatory things you could say about myself and our organization online. And there are actually two different collectives making this stuff up and saying this stuff. So I sued them. And both of them disappeared because they didn't want to be served, and they never reemerged. So that was a success. Here's the downside, right? That cost a lot of money. And of course, we can never collect on them. So we essentially, was the outcome good? Yes. Very expensive, though. And then you have cases like Paramount Fine Foods proprietor, Mohammed Faki, who has, he's a wonderful philanthropist. He was being defamed by this individual named Kevin Johnson. Now, Kevin Johnson has been this hate vlogger that primarily targets Muslims, women, and trans people. And he's been doing it for as long as, like 5 years. He's been doing this for at least 5 years. And he's actually been charged with the willful promotion of hate. And it's an extremely rare charge to lay. And we can talk about the criminal in a minute. He's also lost other defamation cases. And in this case, he and somebody else in his videos suggested that Muhammad was a terrorist, and that you would have to be willing to sexually assault somebody in order to eat at his restaurant. So it was just wildly defamatory, racist stuff. Mohammed Faki actually sued him, and successfully. And actually, the judge called it hate speech at its worst and awarded a $2.5 million finding in damages, right? Just last week, Johnson is running around saying, he's running for mayor of Calgary, and he's saying, oh, I got this coffee brand now called Mayor Mud, referring to Calgary Mayor Nenshi, and saying, I got this other coffee brand called Wasted Native, and it's just a really awful caricature of an Indigenous person, touching on kind of anti-Indigenous racist tropes. So that is to say, he hasn't learned his lesson at all. He still hasn't seen trial for his willful promotion of hate, that criminal charge. And he doesn't care about the defamation law, because at the end of the day, the legal system is effective if you have money, and if the people that you're using the legal system against have an ounce of shame. And if that doesn't exist, right, if they feel like they're just not going to stop no matter what, our kind of civil legal system fails, because there's no kind of follow through on the consequences, right? I mean, Johnson has a court order not to defame Muhammad anymore. And in the last couple of weeks, he keeps going around calling Muhammad a child killer. So, I mean, I understand Muhammad's probably going to try to get him on that at this point and go back to the courts and ask for them to enforce that court order. But my point being that legal tools, they don't always work on the worst of the worst offenders who just have absolutely no shame. So it's one tool in our toolkit, but it has to be used kind of judiciously, given its cost, given its time frames, and given that it doesn't always work.
And now the other largest avenue of hate dissemination on social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, all these forums that are spreading hate around the world so fast in such numbers, reaching millions and millions of people almost instantaneously. And the one thing is lone individuals that are perpetrating hateful comments against individuals and groups, but now we have very large, very well-funded social media platforms that seem to be selectively taking down hate speech. So certain groups, their content that is offensive is taken down, whereas from what I'm seeing from our perspective and some research done by Dr. Heidi Beirich, who's formerly of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Facebook in particular looks like there's a double standard when it comes to hate against Muslims propagated online. Case in point, Myanmar or India or other places. That content, for whatever reason, the reason for not taking it down is newsworthiness and freedom of speech. But other groups seem to, it seems to be a double standard. Perhaps we can talk about this huge aspect of how hate is being disseminated and certain double standards social media companies have in policing hate on their platforms.
Sure. So, I mean, to start on it, I mean, social media companies are not acting in good faith. And I'll particularly speak about Facebook here. There's a lot of confounding issues here. I mean, there's been a lot of whistleblowers coming forward from Facebook saying, we have the ability to address this. We're not addressing this. They claim that there's a lot less hate on their platform than we know that there is. They claim that their reporting of hate results in that hate content being taken down, and often it doesn't. And generally speaking, I mean, even when they do anything, it's often too little too late. Like, they allowed QAnon to grow on Facebook. It wouldn't have grown quite so prestigiously without, the Facebook and Facebook algorithm promoting it for so long. And then when they do remove it, it's too late. They're not removing the users, they're removing the groups, and the users can just find each other again and make new groups. So it's not particularly effective. Then you have other issues, like, for example, even as bad as moderation is on Facebook, it's much better in English than in any other language. I mean, they barely have content moderators in other languages. So you'll have issues like with what's happening in India, for example, and which Facebook would be able to put much less resources to. Well, that's a choice they've made, right? They don't have as many non-English speaking moderation. Fundamentally, the solution is difficult because Facebook is going to continue to operate as they operate. They have, the political power and money of a small country, right? If not more than that. And they make deliberate choices. They're facing regulation right now here in Canada. And what we're trying to do is the government is going to put forward a piece of legislation that addresses quote unquote online harms. It's going to include things like child pornography, but also, for the purpose of our conversation today, it's going to include online hate. And we don't know exactly what's going to be in that legislation yet. The government consulted with us and with many others to ask, what do you think should be in it? And we made one really kind of clear point. There's so much hate that having individuals look at each piece of it to determine what is hateful and what is not is insufficient, right? It can't possibly keep up with just how often hate is posted. So any solution has to require companies to proactively take down hate speech, harassment, and threats. And even if we just started with the really obvious examples of like celebrating violence towards groups, racial slurs, and targeted harassment campaigns based on somebody's background, if we just started with really basics, it would make quite an impact. And then we could move on from there. But let's just start with the basics. But our feeling was, companies have to be forced to proactively remove it or face fines. And I don't mean like slap on the wrist fines that just become a cost of doing business. I mean fines that put the company's existence into jeopardy, right? Like, they need to actually be fined to the point that they decide that being, a productive part of our society, or at least a marginally responsible part of our society, is in their best financial self-interest, because that's the only way they'll make any change there. Now, Again, we don't know exactly what's in that legislation. We expect it to come out in April or May. If it doesn't get pushed again, because it's actually supposed to come out, it's supposed to be out by now, so it should be out in April or May. And then we'll kind of push the government. There's going to be an independent oversight body. And of course, we do have to have some concerns about free speech and free expression, right? Those are important values, and they protect kind of all of us. Now, hate speech is not free speech. We've got to make sure that their companies aren't kind of going so far that they're accidentally removing things that aren't hate speech. So this independent regulator should hear appeals from people who think their content was taken down in error, but not the other way around. Some people are suggesting that the victims of hate speech, rape threats, death threats should have to go to a regulator, fill out a bunch of forms, and then have that regulator go to the social media company to ask them to take the content down. That's backwards, right? Because why are we putting more onus on the victims here when the companies are already putting the hate out? Like, the companies have to remove it, and if they don't proactively, then we should be fining them a lot.
And in terms of regulators, now it seems like a lot of politicians and world leaders espouse hateful views, whether it's in France currently with the crackdown on the Muslim community in France, in the United States. It seems like the Republican Party, a lot of their element, the far right element, is definitely espousing hate, and the previous president did nothing to more inflamed it rather than quelled it. And with a Muslim ban, actually just saying it's a Muslim ban, it just perpetrates in the general public that it's something to be feared. Muslims are to be feared. The religion is to be feared. So now, with actual government officials that have these type of views, I know it's a huge kind of, like, in terms of getting policy changes, and especially as a lot of these social media companies are based in the United States, and in terms of Donald Trump's election, the Facebook, from our research, bent over backwards to help them to not seem partisan against the Republican Party. So they almost seem like they are willing to appease far-right elements of the Republican Party. And so in the United States is where all these companies are based, and the meaningful regulation needs to happen from there. But the political will in the process, and the great divide that's happening between left and right, Democrats and Republicans, is it realistic to think that meaningful regulation could happen in the current climate in the United States that could affect the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky. That's one of the big stumbling blocks here, is that they are always going to hide behind U.S. law. But what we can do is, if we put in this rules against hate content, right, we can get our allies to follow suit. We're already kind of in conversations with the UK, Australia, a few other places, kind of talking about coordinating our approach to Facebook and other social media companies. So if enough countries come forward with these kind of rules and regulations, Facebook will have to apply them more broadly. Like, they'll have to invent, like, they have the ability to do this, right? I mean, they're a very smart company, but they'll have to, like, turn on that kind of content moderation and the algorithms and figure out, they have to make that system work when there's a few countries that are requiring it of them, right? I'm also pushing, I doubt it'll make it into the government's bill, but I think that, it's something we have to seriously consider, is if they do not pay their fines, if they do not follow the laws as written by our country, at what point do we turn the tap off on them, right? And just how difficult is that going to be to do politically? Can we allow this giant company that doesn't follow our laws to operate in our country if they're doing so in, like, a discriminatory manner? And how upset are people going to be if we turn off their access to Facebook, or block Facebook from sending hate propaganda to Canadians, right? I mean, that is, I don't think it'll get to that point, but that's kind of the ultimate question here, is, do we have the stomach to shut them down? I don't have the answer to that. That's a very difficult political question. But I'm hopeful that with these kind of online harm legislation, that Facebook will play ball well enough once we put these rules on them, One thing that's also not being discussed nearly enough in the context of this is, we're talking about the big platforms. That's the most important thing to talk about. It is, because that's where hate reaches everyday normal people, right? Thanks in part to things like Facebook's algorithm. But what about the smaller platforms that are specifically designed to host hate speech, by which I mean DLive, BitChute, Gab, and there's a myriad of other smaller ones, right? These companies, why would we have any faith that they're going to like either pay our fines or follow our rules or anything like that? They're not going to, right? So we need to be talking about things like international criminal sanctions for people who are purposely flaunting our law, and or prohibiting them from importing hate propaganda into Canada, by which I mean blocking the IP address of their site from Canadian internet companies, right? So that they can't push their hate into Canada. So we got to be prepared to take some steps today to address the big social media companies, stuff like that. But we got to be prepared to back that up with a stick later on if they continue to prove themselves to be bad actors and unwilling to take meaningful action.
And with the Donald Trump in particular being banned from Twitter, to a degree, temporarily from Facebook, alternative social media platforms that he's planning to put together to bring his base back to him, and then Parler and other Breitbart and One America Network. So all of these, and even Fox News, which is quote unquote mainstream. So there's multi-layers of indoctrination, whether it's online and it's extreme conspiracy, or Fox News, which could be considered quote unquote credible. So on multiple fronts, whether it's online or even traditional media. So these are elements that just on a day-by-day basis just indoctrinate people to these views. Now, just getting back to diversity in the executive ranks at these social media companies, or even within government itself, as there is probably minimal Muslim or other people of color or people of multiple different faith backgrounds represented in government or represented in social media companies. So the understanding of what this content, how it affects these groups and why is probably not, from my perspective, they don't necessarily see how dangerous it is, possibly from my perspective, and possibly minimal sympathy because they don't necessarily understand the implications and how it's impacting communities like ours. Would that be a fair comment, the lack of diversity in the executive ranks at all these social media and traditional media companies?
I couldn't speak to whether they have any diversity in their upper ranks, but I would be surprised if they did, because if they did and they're kind of allowing it to go forward, that'd be really surprising. I think part of their mindset, if I can put myself into their mindset for just a moment, is they look at Facebook probably as an entirety of a business and look at this hate stuff and see it as a small subset of their content, right? And they're a business. So they're putting, they put as much effort and money into addressing the hate thing as they think makes sense for them as a business. So it's a PR thing. It's a very small subset of what they care about, because at the end of the day, their motive is to generate profit. Their motive is not to change the world or enable democratic participation everywhere or protect free speech. For all of their lies that those are values they hold, they aren't. They're a business. So fundamentally, I think greater diversity at the executive levels may help take them off that track a little bit. But I think really the solution is more in the lines of hitting them where it hurts, which is in the money. So I think, it's the really big fines that can have more of an impact, although I'm all for more diversity at the executive levels of these companies. But I think it's an example of, when kind of money makes something rotten to its core, and government needs to step in to make sure that a corporation stops hurting people.
And a corporation is has shareholders, and every quarter has to post earnings and metrics that are better than the quarter previous, the year previous, year over year. And part of the metrics to show, at least for these social media companies, is user engagement, the hours of engagement, and YouTube in particular is one of their metrics is how to keep us engaged as the individuals, because we are the product. We're not paying for Facebook, YouTube, or any of these platforms, but in essence, our attention is being sold as a revenue source for the company. And part of what keeps us engaged is content that appeals to us. And if it's hateful content, the algorithms will serve up the content that appeals to that individual and keep them engaged, and they in part will sell that attention to advertisers and generate more revenue. So it seems like in their metrics and their bottom line is the more people are engaged with whatever content, those metrics are met. They keep achieving their goals financially as well as the user metrics. And as a result, if there's no significantly huge penalties or possible antitrust kind of action against them, it's not likely they're going to change, because they have a whole corporate and shareholder accountability, fiduciary responsibility to answer to. And if they're not hit on the bottom line, which will affect the shareholders, they're not going to do anything. It seems like that's possibly the core. If their financial bottom line is hit because of the hate content, that could motivate change. Or if there's regulatory antitrust to harm the existential nature of their business, those are the only two areas that seem could motivate meaningful change. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. And we have a chance to do it. I mean, we can pressure them and fine them, but we're just like one little country. We're like a really tiny percentage of their user base. But if we're the first domino that like meaningfully falls, and then we're followed by the UK, we're followed by Australia, we get followed by, eventually, as we keep getting followed by other countries taking similar measures, it's going to start to sting, right? And they're going to have to change their business model a little bit. Part of also what we're asking for in this legislation is that the companies have to be they have to open up their algorithms for review, so that we can kind of advocate and instruct them to build in safeguards, so that yes, the algorithm is supposed to, if you like something, point more of it your way. But when it comes to hate stuff, just doesn't do that. Like that would go a long way, right? Where it's, you're watching some video by Stefan Molyneux or Jordan Peterson, and it just says, instead of like next recommended video, it's like, how about you go take a walk outside and maybe call your grandma, instead of here's another video of them.
Well, you brought up another point, and there are companies like Moonshot and others that have the redirect method, where if somebody's searching for, how do I kill a Muslim or something like that, and they will have their own way to redirect them to resources that would be the alternative, something that would be the counter programming to that search. How effective do you think those strategies would be?
I haven't seen any evidence it works. Now, theoretically, it might work with a very, very small subset of those people. And if we're talking about if 0.5% of the population that searches hate stuff and finds something through a redirect method, that might actually be worth it, even if because you got to remember, percentages of very large numbers can still be pretty large numbers. So even if it only works like 0.5% of the time, that doesn't make it not worthwhile. I just don't see it working on scale, because if you take somebody who's searching like I don't know, some kind of racist search term, and instead you ask them like, oh, hey, would you rather read these materials about how you shouldn't do that? Like, how many people are just going to turn around and say, oh yeah, totally, I'll totally read this liberal created guide on how not to hate Muslims, sure, right? Like, so I'm pretty skeptical about these what we call counter speech ideas, where you try to present somebody with an opposite argument. I think that there is a time and a place that counter speech can work, But in terms of somebody just Googling hateful stuff and being presented with a different link to look at, I'm very skeptical about. Now, I'm open to reading research that suggests, that it does work on occasion, but I just haven't seen kind of any compelling evidence that that it works.
So now we, in wrapping up our conversation and where we've kind of culminated, we know there's multiple problems, and it's great to hear about this legislation here in Canada that you all have been consulted on. What is the hope for the future? To leave the viewers and the listeners with some hope that part of this conversation is allies like us working together in our respective provinces and areas of expertise to address meaningful change. So let's talk about some hope for the future and what are possible takeaways that could be interesting, and also how people can find there's Antihate.ca, but to also to contribute to the work that you do. So the takeaways, and then how people can connect with your work as well as contribute to it.
Sure. So I've spent 5 years tracking down Nazis, Islamophobes, bad people. And, in some cases, we've managed to shut down some groups. We've managed to shut down, they have hate podcasts. We've managed to shut a few of those down. It's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, right? But we've whacked quite a lot of whack-a-moles. And that's great. And I'm not saying our work isn't meaningful, because I think we've accomplished some good things there. I think we've kept hate movements marginal. I think by exposing the hate, the really naked hate within hate movements, it prevents some people from getting involved. It prevents some groups from working with each other, because, there might be two groups that hate Muslims, for example, but the Nazis don't want to work with the non-Nazis, and the non-Nazis don't want to work with the full-blown Nazis. So we're still not talking about great people, but it's good if they're not working together. It kind of keeps them more marginal. So we've had a lot of successes. That being said, what this bill, or not, but what this piece of legislation could accomplish could be worth more than what I've spent my last 5 years doing, right? Even an imperfect piece of this legislation could prevent more hate incidences, could prevent more hate group organizing, could disrupt the hate ecosystem in Canada. This little piece of legislation could do more for that than everything else I've done in the past 5 years or anything I could do in the next 5 years. So I think the positive message here is that even if this piece of legislation is imperfect, I think it'll be very helpful, right? Even if it's not the silver bullet, even if it's, it's not going to solve the problem, but by disrupting the hate ecosystem to a certain degree and by reducing the amount of hate online, it's going to be safer for women, people of color, LGBTQ plus persons, everybody to participate in journalism and politics and to just express an opinion online, right? Once we get the racists and the trolls and the haters and the hate content and the death threats and the rape threats off there, it's going to be better for everybody who's having conversations just generally, but also in our space, right? So that's kind of my positive takeaway here is this piece of legislation, even if it's not perfect, could do a lot. And my call to action here is there's a lot of organizations working on a lot of things right now. And I'm not going to take away from any work that anybody else is doing, but I do want to put kind of an earworm in everybody right now that this piece of legislation is probably the most important thing that's happening in our world in Canada right now. And my call to action around it is, if you got an organization or an organization or you're an advocate yourself or anything, read up on this legislation that's coming out, read up on what different groups are talking about, what we should do about online harms, and get ready to advocate when the legislation comes out. We're either to support the parts that are worth supporting or to push the government further if they're not meeting those recommendations to make this a meaningful piece of legislation. So if I can, that's my call to action, because we have kind of one shot to make this is our best opportunity to make a meaningful change to disrupt the hate ecosystem in Canada. It's the best opportunity I can think of in the last 5 years, and we got one shot at it. So that's my call to action. Let's get involved around this one issue. Whatever else you're working on, put some time and effort into this one issue, and it'll make a big difference.
So to lobby our MPs and more or less to lobby our elected representatives to support this and legislate this legislation. That would be what we could do as citizens of Canada, just to kind of rally around a campaign to support the legislation that you've referenced.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know if we'll necessarily be taking lead on it, or some other organization will, but hey, if you got an organization, start your own petition or sign on to another one. Let's have lobby days. Let's talk to our MPs about why this is important. If you've been the victim of online hate, harassment, death threats, abuse, and you're willing and comfortable and safe sharing your story, when that legislation drops, that might be the time to share that story to get the most impact and hopefully address it so that other people don't go through that kind of awful stuff in the future. So there's a lot that we can do together around the time this legislation comes out, but it's just got to be a full court press. Anything you can do, tweet your MP for a starter, call them, chat with, whatever local community organization you're with and say, hey, have we written the government a letter about this yet? And if not, let's write them a quick letter from us too. Just full court press.
Absolutely. And just the final takeaway, Antihate.ca, any other ways to connect, maybe your Twitter handle or other avenues to connect with yourself and your team and your work, and also where folks can contribute to the great work that you're doing.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, we're a small organization, so we don't have a lot of overhead. Kind of every buck we get goes to commissioning a story so that we can do more research or shine a light on bad things happening. Or, it'll make the difference whether we have, a fourth staff person or not next year. So like every buck that goes to us goes right to something. And if you want to give, we really much appreciate it. And you can do that at Antihate.ca/donate. Otherwise, we also have a newsletter. So, maybe you can't follow our social media 24/7, and totally fair. But you can go to our website, Antihate.ca, and type in your email address and your name, and we'll send you an email every week, kind of with a roundup of stories, either by us or by others, that we thought were kind of important to read in this kind of anti-hate group space for the week. And of course, we're on social media on both Facebook. We're on Facebook. We kind of have to be. And Twitter at facebook.com/Antihate.ca, and Twitter at Antihate.ca.
So it's almost like the Southern Poverty Law Center in the north, and you guys are like at the Great Wall, protecting from the White Walkers coming into affecting the rest of society. So in essence, it's a great work that you guys are doing. And I'm on your newsletter. I get that email and I read that, and I really, really enjoy the content, and it's very well done. And your website is excellent. So we really highly recommend those that are wanting to follow the great work, Antihate.ca. Evan, thank you so much for joining us for this time, and we're looking forward to publish this and share with our audience.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the thoughtful questions.